Today I would like to list out my favorite Gorguts albums in order. I want to preface this entire video by stating that I don't think any of these albums are bad or bland. The vision for each album that Gorguts created was realized fully and even improved upon in the following albums. Despite one album being ranked lower than another, it's only a matter of preference rather than a statement of failure in some way. Gorguts' catalog is a perfect evolution from youth into maturity, because the band, especially lead vocalist and guitarist Luke LeMay, never ceased to keep creating and evolving in technique and style. First, we have Considered Dead. The first thing to acknowledge with this album, being Gorguts' first full-length album, is how powerful of an impact it had on the death metal genre and other artists since then. Looking at the album now, one might think of it as a pretty standard release, especially with the oversaturation of the genre that occurred within the following years of its release. Competing with bands such as Death, Cannibal Corpse, Obituary, etc., the genre was exploding with bands doing new things, whether it be new vocal styles that were distinct from any others, or implementing progressive elements in their music via odd time signatures or frequent or infrequent tempo changes. Gorguts stood out because they were not only a pioneer of the genre of old school death metal, they also developed their own unique sound, while not being too vastly different vocally or instrumentally from other similar bands at the time. Considered Dead is a classic death metal album that stands up even today, being somewhat groovy in certain songs such as Disincarnated or Stiff and Dead. This album contained the typical death metal signatures of growling vocals and some fast-paced drum beats, but also differed in slowing down where other bands typically keep the same beat or even speed up. Considered Dead has a certain diversity in its songs, whether it be tempo or rhythm, while other bands had a sort of quote-unquote sameness in many of their songs. Deicide, in my opinion, is pretty guilty of this in some of their later releases, post-2000. Gorguts would later improve and craft their own sound, not willing to keep the same formula or repeat the same thing from their last album. Considered Dead is a solid release with no real faults, in my opinion, especially considering that it was their first full-length album. Later albums would contain many more standout elements in either songwriting or the instrumental performances, but Considered Dead is a classic death metal album that still stands pretty strong today. Next we have The Erosion of Sanity. While many bands fell into the trap of just repeating much from their last album, where the two releases don't sound entirely different in a sonic manner, Gorguts improved on all fronts for this release. As many bands began to experiment with progressive elements in their songs, such as Pestilence, Death, and Atheist, Gorguts followed suit by improving and diversifying their songs too. Many bands began to be dropped from labels or see less sales on these more progressive albums, with Gorguts also being dropped from their label, Roadrunner, for the lack of immediate popularity in sales from the album. Some bands would revert this change in progression with their following release, I'm looking at you, Pestilence, but Gorguts would continue this trend of development with their release of Obscura in 1998. What made The Erosion of Sanity so special is that the progression of their music was not done in a poor or unsustainable way. They merely improved on the elements already present in their previous album. For example, Condemned to Obscurity contains the same elements of double bass drum kicks and slower tempo riffs, diversified over the tracks with more styling to lyrics, vocal range, and riffage. The playing is more intelligent, and there is less of this element of sameness in the album. On top of this, Luke LeMay's vocals are noticeably stronger and have more power behind them. Many bands are guilty of just doing one-note vocals that lack any highs or even diversity in those lower growls. Every instrument and part of this album is an improvement from Considered Dead, being a bit more progressive and experimental in nature. The Erosion of Sanity is a solid album that performs exactly how it was written, just as Considered Dead, and introduces different elements to their music that are emphasized much more on later releases. Personally, I just enjoy the development of Luke's vocals and the overall mix of the album, but I don't have any issues with it or things that could have been done better. Now we have Pleiades Dust. This EP is by no means a bad or even lukewarm album. It honestly plays much better as a story, where you sit and listen to it entirely from beginning to end in one sitting. It's a story that's compounded by the flow of the album and its lyrics. It starts with lyrics such as destructive minds, turning life to ashes relentlessly, describing the fall of Rome and subsequently moving to Baghdad, emphasizing the darkness that Western Europe fell into afterwards, known as the Dark Ages. With such a story-like EP, it's hard to judge it piece by piece because each part stands alone, but also come together for the overall story and movement. The rise and fall of certain parts of what I call this album's journey create the distinction between the parts, often signified by a minute or two of instrumentals and vocals, then separated from the next part by only instrumentals. This fall, which the band creates by slowing down in either tempo or eliminating use of certain instruments, fills the gaps between the parts, or sections, in the EP, despite there not being a solid distinction as songs usually give in an album, such as different song titles or, track 1, track 2, etc. The song ebbs and flows as an art piece rather than just a song. Because of this nearly 33-minute song being one singular track rather than split up as albums typically do, it emphasizes its cohesion as a story, intended for someone to listen to fully in one sitting rather than piecemeal. In interviews, Luke LeMay has talked about the thematic elements of this release, as well as the movements of the EP in their respective parts of the overall story and the music itself. Aside from the lyrical and thematic elements, Pleiades' Dust is a sonically diverse story in and of itself. It takes on certain elements that you might see in classical music, where each movement is signified and different from the next. Speeding up or slowing down in tempo, changing in rhythm, following a different period in time or event. Personally, this release took a little bit to grow on me, as on my first listen through, I initially skipped through a little bit to only skim what would grab my attention. As I then later sat down and listened to it in one sitting, I read along with the lyrics and saw some interviews with Luke LeMay, and the overall story and cohesion became much more clear. Luke's vocals are intense and pointed, emphasizing their part in the story, though I feel like they're slightly less diverse than on their previous release, Colored Sands. These two albums do share in their progression and thematic nature, specifically with the arrangements of instruments and the lyrics themselves. However, my preference for Luke's vocals gives this a slightly lower position than Colored Sands does, not just because, it's not as diverse lyrically or musically, there's just less vocals overall, I feel like, which I really enjoy his lyrics and his vocals, so I would have liked to hear more of them just because they're that damn good. This EP is more of a conceptual art piece than your standard metal album. The storytelling is done through the different pieces of this record and the different sections, which add a lot more atmosphere to the listening experience. The spaces of ambience between parts do well to add to the story that is told, but in lieu of riffage, blast beats, and soaring vocals. Pleiades' Dust stands more of an experience rather than an actual album, transcending this status to achieve a bigger picture with its message. I love this EP as a story, but as an album it has a lot of empty spaces that just do more for the message and meaning. To preface these last three albums, each of them has a unique sound and theme, so rather than one album being definitively better than another, they all have a sonically different sound than the one previous and the one following. Obscura is, for example, a chaotic and unpredictable album that experiments a lot more with song structure than Erosion of Sanity does. From Wisdom to Hate reels it in a bit more, with more developed songs that hit you harder with more melodies and grooves, being less discombobulated than Obscura. Colored Sands leans heavily into the lyrical and thematic sphere of songwriting, with its tracks and lyrics telling a story as you listen through. Each album before Colored Sands did have a general or specific theme, but followed a more general album layout. It's hard to rank these following three albums as better or worse than another, because they're all equally good in what they do. Gorguts didn't intend for each album to just be a sequel or follow up to the one before it. Instead, each increment is an evolution of their sound, songwriting, and technique. These next three are all tied for the top spot and are in no particular order. I love them all equally, and each provide a different listening experience, with Gorguts' signature style of songwriting. After disbanding in 2005, Luke LeMay joined fellow bandmate Steve Hurdle in the group Negativa, but became uncomfortable with the amount of improvisation in the band's music. At the recommendation of Hurdle himself, Luke reformed Gorguts in 2008. With the band's reformation, Luke began writing and searched for new members for the band, adding drummer John Longstreth and then guitarist Kevin Hufnagel at Hurdle's recommendation. LeMay also added Colin Marston on bass, completing the lineup for the resurrected Gorguts. The three new additions to the band, two of which, Hufnagel and Marston, being classically trained, added the depth and repertoire needed to push Gorguts' conceptual and technical style forward. Songs such as Forgotten Arrows, whose riffs surround you and circulate through your ears, or Ember's Voice, are emphatic proof of this development in Gorguts' unique style of music, adding many textural elements on top of or in tandem with their signature style of heaviness. On Colored Sands, the symphonic The Battle of Chamdo is a nearly 5-minute instrumental transition track with careful compositions from a dramatic string section placed between two heavy and equally complex tracks. This album focuses on Tibetan themes, pulling from both the history and culture of the country to form the overall direction and lyrics of the album's story. Luke describes the many different ideas in the album, reflected in both the lyrics and the arrangement of the songs. It also reflects the development of Luke's abilities as a composer and musician, as well as Gorguts' refinement of its own styles. Colored Sands does not lack technique or performance either, while Luke displays a fuller vocal delivery with songs such as Enemies of Compassion and Reduced to Silence. His mature growls are both pointed and consuming. They stand at the front line of each song and lead the instruments alongside them, layering with each other to create a thick wall of sound that washes over you like a tidal wave. Each drum kick and riff chug is both uniquely distinct and adds to the whole. Overall, Colored Sands is the maturation of Gorguts' style, with elements of each of their previous albums added and polished in this release. Obscura is a unique record because it implemented a more discordant approach to their compositions. Rather than continuing a more generic 1-2-1-2-3 style of writing, Obscura contained more odd time signatures and dissonant riffs. Songs like the title track and Subtle Body are an onslaught of blast beats and string pulls, lasting for full and half measures before transitioning into a different section or rhythm. The complexity and slight oddity of pushing and pulling guitar work really adds a unique flavor to the album, forming the basis of their signature style. On top of the sometimes unpredictable nature of the songs, Luke and bandmate Steve Hurdle both perform vocals for the album, something we would not see in the albums released after Obscura. The high-pitched screeches, at times sounding like pleas for help, stand out in songs like Rapturous Grief, alongside middle and lower-pitched growls. The departure from the more typical song structures and overall rarity of the sounds you hear really solidifies Obscura as an album that has not since been replicated and cannot be. In my opinion, Obscura is the fastest paced album in Gorguts' discography and assaults you with this intensity and speed. It is unbridled fury, aggressive and pointed. The distinct wildness of the album made it stand out from many other bands at the time, being creative and inventive, paired with the fast-paced blast beats and drum fills. This album screeches and soars like a boar, lashing out at anything and anyone around it, ripping and tearing through your eardrums throughout. The rawness of this album and its experimentation is my favorite, especially on the title track and Subtle Body. Lastly, From Wisdom to Hate is tied for first place because it, too, has a meticulously crafted sound and style. Being a bit more melodic in nature, From Wisdom to Hate dials it down with the impulsiveness and converges with a more focused ferocity. Immediately, Inverted hits you with blast beats and deeper growls. Luke adds more power to his vocal delivery in this record, both in the highs and lows. There are more contrasts between slower and faster sections in the songs, especially in Behave Through Mythos. There's less chaos in this album also, but it forms a more cohesive style where each element and song evolves from Obscura's more raw and unrelenting barrage of sound. The guitar work on this album is also chunkier, in addition to the riffage having less screeches and squeals than previously. This owned-in style adds more rhythm and melody to each song. From Wisdom to Hate adds groove and stability to the mix, which further developed elements of writing that Gorguts would continue to improve upon in following albums. Gorguts also started leaning a bit more into thematic elements for this album, a trend that would multiply exponentially in their next two releases. The subject matter in each song allows Luke to create an album that is not only thematically cohesive, but also able to be divided into parts that stand out alone and come together beautifully. I like this album because it contrasts with Obscura, like the opposite side of a coin. Obscura is wild, relentless, filled with energy and raw power, while From Wisdom to Hate reels in its sound to hit harder, slowing down to increase the force of impact in each riff. It has a great amount of slower and faster sections, with the title track being one of my favorites. It hits harder and chugs, with Luke's vocals filling more room as he adds power behind them. Rather than lacking in one way or another, which Gorguts has not done in any of their albums, it is a perfect follow-up to Obscura. Gorguts is one of the most unique and talented bands out there. While there may be other bands who are more progressive or technical, Gorguts achieves exactly what it envisions when writing and making an album. Throughout their catalog, they have evolved, improved, experimented, and taken risks. While still a classic band in the death metal genre, they refuse to stick with or repeat one singular formula, refusing to become a cookie-cutter band that re-releases the same album with a different face. Whether you enjoy old-school death metal or more progressive metal, Gorguts blends both elements perfectly for fans of either genre to enjoy.